So we're hangar flying with Dr. Keith Roxo on a Sunday morning here in Connecticut. And Doc, I don't care how healthy you think you are. You go in for one of these medical, FAA medical exams, there's some apprehension. And if there isn't, you probably got the wrong approach.
Yeah, I agree. Having started my career as a professional pilot before going to medical school, and same thing with my partner, we used to have the same exact fears all the time. We joke about how the best you can do is break even. If you were medically qualified before that exam, the best you can be is medically qualified after that exam. And I think what we see most often is people treat it like going to their doctor for a checkup. But it's not. It's an examination every bit as much as your private check ride or your commercial check ride or instrument check ride, in that it is a pass-fail, and that is an examiner just like a DPE is. And so people should be preparing like it's an exam. And there are ways to do that, but that's not commonly understood.
Before we talk about what you've created, why don't you give a little bit about your unique professional experience you bring to the table?
Well, I started off as an F-18 pilot in the Navy. I graduated from Top Gun as a professional adversary, where I flew F-18s, F-16s, F-5s. My business partner, Dan Monlux, he was also an F-18 pilot in the Navy. And then we both ended up deciding to go to medical school. From there, we both got board certified in aerospace medicine, which is a specialty specific about aviation and space medicine. And then in the Navy, while we were practicing our craft there, it was our job to be the doctor for the aviators and help them out if they had a problem, keep them flying, get them back to flying status if for some reason they were medically disqualified. So we use that same philosophy now with the FAA protocols, and we're both HIMSS senior AMEs. So we have pretty much the highest level qualifications you can get from a flying and from a pilot or from a medical side. I have my ATP, my CFI, my MEI, and then all of the physician qualifications as well. We like to say that there are effectively three types of AMEs. So you have the AME who maybe got the qual because he's got a few people in his community that asked him. He's not necessarily passionate about aviation medicine. He does his minimum number of exams per year, which is 5. He does his recurrent required training, which is once every 3 years. This does not mean he is a bad doctor, but the FAA puts out updates 11 times a year. And if you are not staying on top of those updates and you're not performing a decent number of exams, when you see something new, they may not have the time built into their business structure to help you with that complicated issue. Where you may be eligible to get issued your medical, they may defer you because they are just not familiar with the process. Then you have the AME, where they are doing 30 to 40 exams a day. Their whole business model is based on doing the exam itself. If you are not already qualified with no significant issues and no paperwork issues, it's not a problem. But as soon as you bring them 15 or 20 pages of medical records that say you can be issued at the exam, that is not budgeted in their time for the day, and you run the risk of them deferring you unnecessarily. Again, not because they're a bad doctor, but because it does not fit their business model. So then there's the group in the middle. This is probably the rarest AME, somebody who's passionate about aviation, maybe they're a pilot themselves, and their business model is structured in such a way that they have the extra time to assist you. We get the question a lot where somebody will contact us and they'll say, well, I asked my AME for help and he wouldn't help me. Well, chances are you paid him the $150 or $200 for the exam, and now you're asking that doctor to do more work without offering to pay them any more money. So when you pay for that exam, you're paying for that 15 or 20 minute appointment to perform the exam. You did not pay them to review the records. You did not pay them for the advice on how to get through the process. And that is where we come in as well. So some of these AMEs, they are set up to do that. There's a few really good ones that we know. They're passionate about aviation medicine, and that's how they're built. But most AMEs, their business is not designed that way. We meet them all the time when we go to training. We see the updates every month. We circulate them through our whole company. We go to multiple training events per year so that we stay up to speed on the latest information that the FAA is putting out. And most AMEs just are not able to do that because their business isn't set up that way.
So talking more about the approach to medical certification, going to an AME isn't exactly like going to your primary care physician for an annual checkup, right?
Correct. Your physician is there to try and assess how you're doing and figure out if you need to get better and what is the best way to get you better. Whereas the FAA Medical Certification Division is there to assess your aeromedical risk. How likely are you to have an issue in flight due to the medical issue that you may or may not have? So it's more like an insurance company looking at risk from a car insurance standpoint. If you show up to the AME with a whole bunch of medical conditions that are not managed by proper modern protocols or unsafe medications, that's like telling the FAA, hey, I'm a 21-year-old driver with 10 speeding tickets and I just bought a sports car. That insurance company does not want to insure you. And so it's a slightly different mindset. And so that's why certain things where your doctor thinks you're okay isn't necessarily compatible with aeromedical safety. Part of that has to do with not just the condition, but maybe the medications used, and that most doctors don't understand the impacts of higher altitude or the sensations of flight as well.
So let's take that into the real world. What mistakes are you seeing pilots make from a medical standpoint? And I'm talking about conditions. They've got a condition that may be under control, and they think it's under control with their primary care doc. Then they go to an AME and they lay this out on the table, and it may be a different ballgame.
More often than not, the issue is in the proper documentation.
And that's where Wingman Med comes in.
Right. So the FAA is literally only looking at you on the paperwork provided to them. So you could be perfectly stable and completely healthy with a medical condition that meets FAA guidelines, but if it isn't documented that way, then the FAA has no way to know that. So let's take an example of hypothyroidism. So relatively benign type of condition can be treated with a shelf-stable pill. If you are making sure that you're taking your pills on a regular interval and your hormones are in a good range, then it has virtually no impact to your daily life. But if the FAA is not aware of the dosage, if they are not aware of your lab values, then they are not aware of how well you are doing. And somebody who has not been taking their medication or has not been within the proper ranges can suffer significant fatigue effects, and that would be damaging for safety of flight. So that's the difference between getting your medical issued at the exam and having to wait 6 to 9 months to get your medical, is do you have the right documentation or not?
Okay, so let's use that example. Somebody that's got subclinical hypothyroid, and now they go and see you folks. What might you do to help get them started in the right direction?
The first thing we do is assess the totality of their medical situation. People will come to us and say, here's my one condition that I'm concerned about. And we will say, let's take a look at everything, because sometimes people are concerned about a medical condition and the FAA really isn't that concerned about it. But then there's a condition that pilot might have that they are not concerned about, that the FAA is concerned about. So we try and look at the pilot as a whole, not just the one issue they're looking at. So we run people through a questionnaire screener. We actually call it our MedExpress simulator, because it is the exact same questions as the MedExpress, because we want to see how a pilot is going to answer those questions. Then we're going to take any of the potential issues and provide very specific guidelines to that pilot. Hey, this is exactly what we need from the paperwork from your doctor in order to get through the process as quickly as possible. They can then take that back to their doctor and say, this is the level of detail that I need. And we provide examples. They're generic examples because we don't want to be seen as writing the notes for the doctors, but they provide very specific guidelines. This is where things get a little bit different. Your doctor may see you every 6 months or every year, so they don't write a complete history and physical note on you for every appointment. They write essentially what is an update to their last note. But that's not sufficient for the FAA because they don't have access to all the past notes, so the update alone is not sufficient. They have to have the whole story each time.
So what happens on first contact with the service? Some free consulting to start off with?
Yes, we do offer a free 15-minute consultation. Now, we do kind of screen people because some folks, there's just no benefit to our service. Somebody who's ineligible for a medical certificate for 5 years because of a recent head injury, there's not a lot of benefit to our free consult at that time. We advise them to contact us as they get closer. Sometimes the FAA has mandated certain in-person evaluations. We offer a remote consultation service. So if they have a mandated in-person consultation, there's not a lot of benefit to our free consultation. But for folks who, the vast majority of people who have an issue, they get offered a chance to schedule a free consultation. So that's a 15-minute consultation with one of our aerospace medicine physicians where we can talk about what their issue is it or is it not concerning? Maybe we can solve their problem in that 15 minutes, but if not, we can explain how we can help them.
And what's the next step after that? If you do spot something that's a red flag, and put the brakes on before you go see your AME.
The next step would be signing up for our record review and case preparation service. So that's kind of where we'll start digging in. Okay, what are all of the issues that are happening with the pilot, and what can we do to make sure that everything is lined up to minimize the time it takes to get a medical? Sometimes that means with the right paperwork, you'll get your medical issued at the exam. Sometimes it means you are required to be deferred, but instead of being deferred and waiting for the FAA to come back and say, hey, these are all the things I would like to see, you've been deferred with everything that they want to see. So they just get to make a decision, and unfortunately right now it's still about 6 months with current times.
Why such a delay?
It's volume. The FAA is currently manned at about 75% for their physician staff when it comes to reviewing these cases, and last year they processed over 450,000 exams. It's just a volume problem right now.
You know, we're in a climate now where the insurance industry is really targeting older pilots, senior pilots. The magic age for a senior pilot is 70 years old. You think they got it right?
I think that it's difficult for me to specifically address that question because I don't see their numbers. I think that if a company is looking at just raw numbers, we have X% of people over, the age of 70, let's say 10% of our people are over the age of 70, but 40% of our payouts are from pilots over 70, I can see why they would make that decision. But perhaps, and again, I'm an outsider in that industry, perhaps there are better ways to drill down in that information. How much are they flying? How much are they getting recurrent instruction? Things like that. I know from speaking at the Fox Rothschild Aviation Symposium a few weeks ago, some of the industry professionals there in insurance did say that if pilots can show they're maintaining currency, they're getting recurrent professional training, then they are more likely to, if they can maintain an FAA medical versus basic med that has more stringent requirements, they're probably going to be more likely to continue to get insured, but the company has to be willing to look at all of those things.
You know, you and I have spoken in the past about, if I read you correctly, you're thinking that there are more pilots that maybe don't give themselves enough credit for being able to get a medical certification, and they'll go basic med instead, or maybe they'll fly light sport. You know, you think they're maybe missing an opportunity there by going basic med instead of a class 3 or even a class 2 medical certificate, you think?
I think overall that's true, but in fairness, basic med is pretty valuable for a lot of people. There are some folks that they have pretty stringent annual requirements by the FAA because the FAA does not limit the size of the aircraft that you fly. With a third class medical, you can fly any size aircraft that you can afford to operate. So they do have more stringent requirements than basic med. So basic med is valuable. With that said, sometimes the health insurance isn't going to cover some of those things, so I can understand why. Another thing that that we hear people talk about is concern about mental health. It's an interesting thing, and I get where people are coming from. They feel that they can't get any help because they'll lose their flight status, and that's not necessarily true. The FAA does treat mental health conditions exactly as they treat physical health conditions. If you have a legitimate disorder or disabling condition, such as a broken ankle, you have to have that treated and you have to recover before you can resume flight. The same thing is with mental health. If you have a legitimate episode of major depression, you have to receive treatment, you have to recover, and then you can resume flight. Now, the difference is the AME can easily assess your ankle. If you walk into the AME and you can jump up and down, he knows that your ankle is fit to fly. It is much more difficult to start to assess other medical conditions, complicated medical conditions such as diabetes, heart disease, and mental health issues. And that's where it requires a significant amount of documentation from other physicians involved in your care. And in mental health, there's no physical exam, there are no laboratory tests. It is a duration of time with a therapist that says how you are doing. Maybe you're on medication, maybe you're not. I will acknowledge people who are on medication, there are significant delays in that process. That again goes back to the manning issue. There are also more modern medications that are not currently being accepted. Part of that has to do with doing review and analysis for aeromedical safety. And when the FAA is understaffed, it is difficult for them to keep up with the demand and evaluate newer medications. So there are things that I think the FAA could be doing better, but largely I don't think they're trying to punish people. With that, there are things that don't have to be reported to the FAA. If I see a physical therapist because I'm getting tendonitis in my elbow, I don't need to report physical therapy to the FAA. That is not a doctor level medical treatment thing that needs to be reported. If you are having some issues with your family, or a person in your family died and you're struggling with it, seeing a member of the clergy, seeing a licensed family counselor, a licensed professional counselor, those things are not required to be disclosed to the FAA, because those do not rise to the level of a medical condition or a medical disorder that they are concerned about. That is you taking care of yourself every bit as much as somebody going to physical therapy. What happens is, if people decide, well, I'm going to use my health insurance and I'm going to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist, well, they want to be paid, and to be paid by your insurance, they are going to diagnose you with something. And as soon as they diagnose you with something, now that starts triggering issues. So this isn't to say that everybody should be paying out of pocket for everything, but there are ways to get help that are not necessarily leading to an early diagnosis that may not be true, that does have to be reported to the FAA.
And that's one of the things that you folks can advise on, what you should report and what you shouldn't. And
Yes.
you made it clear that you don't want to hold back information
Right.
from your AME. If you've got a condition, you've got to talk about it.
That's right.
Let's talk a little bit about the Wingman Med product structure. What might you expect once you start to get into your products?
So we kind of have two main products. We have our main consultation service for somebody that was just diagnosed with a problem. We get those every now and then. Hey, I just got out of the hospital 2 weeks ago from a heart attack. What do I need to do? Well, that's our big consultation service. Or I was just diagnosed with sleep apnea. What do I do? That is I have a problem. I need help to get my medical certificate. And that is a fixed price, no real time limit. It's a fixed price, one-time assistance through the certification process. Now, I do have to tell people it's until you are issued or denied, because a lot of times there's testing involved from other doctors that we can't control. So if you've had a heart attack, you have to show that you've recovered. So you have to pass that testing in order to get your medical. If you don't have a current medical problem, but you are concerned about making sure that you don't have problems, that's what we call our subscription service. A lot of our subscribers are people that we've helped through a pretty significant issue and they have ongoing annual requirements, but others are just the older pilot who is like, I don't want to have problems. I want to maintain a class 3 or a class 2 or even a class 1, and I want to make sure that I'm doing things properly, and I don't want to get caught at the AME and all of a sudden be without my medical. So that subscription service allows for that ongoing communication with us, because that free consultation is just a one-time thing. Another thing that's been in the news the last couple of years is VA disability and pilots. And I think what a lot of people get wrong is they think the FAA is out on this witch hunt for pilots, when in reality it was the VA who passed this information to the Department of Transportation. And the FAA Medical Certification Division was instructed to pull all of the certificates from these pilots, and they said no, they weren't going to do that. Essentially, they said these pilots have been flying for this amount of time without accidents. Let's give them a chance to explain the situation. So that's kind of the first thing I want to talk about. The FAA medical folks are not on a witch hunt for VA folks. They were presented with this information. Now, what do you do? Going back to the medical certification folks, they are only looking at the paperwork in front of them. So on the one hand, they have the pilot's last medical questionnaire that says, I have no disabilities, I have no medical issues, and all of a sudden they get a report from a government agency that says, due to their historical depression or their current depression, they are receiving disability compensation. That is something that they have to rectify. And that is kind of what sparked the whole thing. And again, it goes back to that documentation and making sure you're telling them everything.
And you can look for a full report on Wingman Med in the April 2024 issue of Aviation Consumer magazine. Our big thanks to Dr. Keith Roxo for a good presentation here. It's important to a lot of pilots.
Thank you for having me.